Good morning, everyone. We'll kick it off right now. So my name is Claire, and I am a marketing coordinator for Fleet Complete. And today, with the help of our head of safety, compliance, and regulatory affairs, Marc Moncion, we will be demystifying the ELD rules that will be officially implemented in Canada in 2021. The purpose of this webinar is to bring you up to speed with respect to the electronic logging device mandate in Canada. Marc is a former DOT MTO inspector and has over 25 years of work experience in the trucking industry. He is a strong influencer across a variety of regulatory bodies and social media. He has a commercial driver license and can drive all types of commercial vehicles in North America. He's the author of 3 books and the Ask the Expert blogs that are found on our website. Our Ask the Expert blogs gives you the chance to ask any questions you have about fleet, safety, compliance, DOT audits, roadside inspections, CSA scores, or installation best practices. Marc is a member of the discussion group that is drafting this mandate in Canada by providing commentary to the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators. In fact, right now, they're in the stage of the mandate where Marc is working with Transport Canada and the Canadian Trucking Alliance to draft a third-party certification process for companies that will actually conduct audits of ELD vendors to ensure compliance with the functional requirements in the rulemaking. Because of this relationship, we are going to ask you a series of poll questions throughout the webinar. Marc will be able to share this information gathered from these questions and serve as a voice for individuals like yourselves working in the trucking industry. Before Marc kicks us off, I'll briefly go through the discussion points today and end with a poll question. As promised, in the email invitation, after watching this webinar, you will receive the recording, a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and the list of Q&As answered from the end of this webinar. Speaking of questions and answers, feel free to submit any questions you have for Marc at any time throughout this webinar. If you hover your mouse around the top of your screen, you'll be able to see that there's a little box that says Q&A, and you can click that, and that's where you will be able to submit your questions. If we don't get a chance to answer your question at the end of the webinar live, your question and respective answer will be typed up and shared with the recording of the webinar. So, after explaining the objectives of the Canadian ELD regulation, Marc will explain risks associated with non-compliance, technical standards, and certification. The ELD Implementation Plan, followed by discussions about grandfathering, regulatory exceptions, and ELD malfunctions. Next, he will discuss the procedure during a facility audit, types of supporting documents, facts about the Canadian ELD, similarities between Canada and the US, and some important timelines. Now, to kick us off, we'll start with our first poll question. So you guys should be able to see a question that just appeared on your screen, and we'll give you guys about 20 to 30 seconds to answer. Okay, just 5 more seconds. Awesome, guys. So you can see that the majority of you are using paper logs, which isn't surprising, but a decent amount are actually using an AOBRD or ELD device, so that is super cool. So now that we've kicked us off with the first poll question, Marc will take it away right now with the introduction.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Claire, for the very kind and warm introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today. This is actually the second in the series of seminars, webinars that are going to be focused on the Canada ELD mandate. That being said, though, if you have any questions that are specific to the United States during this webinar, you can also ask the questions during the webinar, or you can alternatively send me an email at Ask the Expert Marc Safety Corner at Fleet Complete. So I'll just kick this off. As you likely know, Transport Minister Marc Garneau announced the implementation of a Made in Canada ELD rule. This was done on the 13th of June 2019. Just so you know, I was actually in attendance on that session. It was over at the Canadian Trucking Alliance offices, and there are several dignitaries and industry leaders, and I actually had the opportunity to meet Mr. Garneau, so it was a very, very pleasant opportunity. With that being said, all drivers of commercial motor vehicles that are currently required to maintain a paper logbook in Canada will then need a third-party certified ELD by June 2021. And I just want to highlight at the highest level, this is quite different than in the United States, where it's going to be a self-certification process. In Canada, it's third-party, and I'll discuss that in greater length as we continue this webinar. So I'll move on now to the objectives of the ELD regulation. So essentially, Transport Canada acknowledged the fact that ELD was the future. They also recognized the benefits of ELD and supported a mandate that was harmonized to the extent possible with the US ELD rule. I'm further on the slides going to highlight what are some of the differences and similarities between the Canada and the US ELD rule. The ELD deployment by commercial motor vehicle operators will increase safety and accountability in trucking in Canada. The US ELD mandate made it very important for Canada to adopt a similar kind of mandate. So many of you in the audience have trucks that perhaps move goods or people into the United States anyway, so you would have been captured by this ELD mandate. So since the US mandate required Canadian domicile carriers to adopt the mandate while traveling into the US, it was just logical for Canada to have our own Made in Canada ELD mandate. Canada, with the mandate, will certainly facilitate fair competition within and between all modes of transportation throughout Canada. Well, moving on to the fatigue and collision risks that are associated with non-compliance. So currently, daily logs in Canada, as you likely know, are easily falsified and are incomplete. In many cases, drivers are not updating their logs to the last change in duty status, and that is certainly problematic if they're stopped at roadside. In some cases, these paper logs are duplicated, they're missing altogether, and really it's an effort to avoid compliance with hours of service regulations. This made it frequently difficult for both safety personnel and MTO DOT officers to detect occurrences of non-compliance with the hours of service requirements. Typically what happened at roadside, again, being a former MTO officer, DOT inspector, MTO inspector, I would frequently have to take a significant amount of time assessing a driver's logs, verifying it with time markers and other associated documents. So when this new rule, it'll be a much faster approach to confirm compliance. It was found based on research that 25% of hours of service convictions were for exceeding the maximum hours. As you know, the maximum hours are 13 hours driving in Canada. It's actually 11 hours in the United States, so 2 hours less. 11% were for operating 2 daily logs at the same time or for falsifying the information in a daily log. 48% of these were for failing to maintain a log or for failing to produce the daily log that is asked by the inspector at roadside or as a result of a facility audit. These stats were strong leading indicators that drivers were exceeding hours of service maximums, and this would translate into fatigued drivers. Of approximately 25% of drivers interviewed in a recent study in the US admitted to omitting hours of service worked in a day, driving more than the daily limit, taking less than the required daily off-duty time, and regularly working longer than permitted. In Canada, the Transport Canada estimated that between 5 and 10% of drivers routinely exceed allowable hours of service. So you can appreciate over a period of time the cumulative fatigue that would be associated with exceeding these hours, to the point where fatigue was associated with between 15 and 20% of crashes in all transportation moves, and that drivers with daily log violations compared to those that were compliant were 2 to 3 times more likely to have a large truck crash. In terms of the technical standards that I want to talk about, there are some minimum performance and design specifications for the ELD. They're based on the US technical requirements, but they have been adapted for the Canadian Hours of Service regulations. I've gone through these technical documents. I've read them several times, as was the case with the United States. And again, I will highlight the differences with the Canadian versus the US rule. Essentially, each ELD model will need to be certified for use by a motor carrier in Canada. So just to throw it out there right now, the US domicile carriers that are using ELD, if they happen to be transporting goods or passengers into Canada, as you know, it's a self-certification model. When they travel and cross the border into Canada, they had better have a certified third-party ELD device. Otherwise, they may be compliant in the United States, but they would not be compliant while in Canada. The ELD model will require certification by an accredited third-party company using compliant software. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on as we move forward. The acceptance criteria is set out in the technical standards and in the regulations. And at the end of this webinar, you'll see the links to these documents if you'd like to take a look at them and read them. So going forward now, ELDs will be tested and certified within the next 2 years. We just recently had a meeting with Transport Canada, and they've provided a framework. We're going to be working on moving this forward, but motor carriers will need to select, acquire, and install ELDs in the commercial vehicles for drivers to begin using them unless otherwise exempt, and we'll talk about exemptions. Only ELDs that have been certified will be for use will be allowed in Canada. The ELD providers, after they've been audited by the third-party certifying body, will be assigned a certificate number. That certificate number is to be displayed and surrendered at Roadside. This will generate an official ELD record for each installed device to ensure compliance for motor carriers and safety officials that the device has been certified. So this is what we would call the output file. And the output file is just a simple term to say the driver's log that is surrendered at Roadside. The process to accredit the certifying bodies and certifying these ELD models is expected to take approximately 12 months. Transport Canada will maintain on their website, similarly to what the US FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, will provide a list of ELD providers and certified devices that can be used to confirm certification. Transport Canada can also suspend or cancel the accreditation of the certifying body, as well as canceling the certification of the ELD vendor if there is any issue with respect to the certification process. A link to this technical standard document, as I said, is included at the end of this webinar.
Awesome, thanks Marc. So we'll start with the second poll question now. And so this one is about the technical standards and certification. So you guys should see a question appear on your screens right now. So have you been on the FMCSA website to see the list of ELD vendors? Just give you a couple more seconds. Awesome. Thank you guys for participating. So as Marc said, we'll make sure to include that link in the collateral that will be provided after the presentation.
So we'll move on now to the ELD Implementation Plan. Essentially, there's going to be a 24-month phase-in period. Therefore, effective June 12th, 2021 will be the target date for which the MTO, DOT, National Safety Code officers across Canada will be asking to see the ELD from you. It is to allow for adequate preparation time for the certification of these ELDs by the certifying body with all the ELD vendors. This will also allow motor carriers and drivers to become fully compliant with the rulemaking. The ELD certification process is expected to take up to 12 months to complete. And as the studies have shown with Transport Canada, most commercial motor vehicles that operate in Canada already have US compliant ELD devices. The difference is these devices have been self-certified by, as Claire mentioned on the polling, by self-certifying their devices and posting this on the US FMCSA's website. This self-certification process will not be acceptable in Canada after the June 2021 date. As you likely know, most ELD devices simply require a seamless remote software upgrade through the over-the-air software with minimal impacts on operations or productivity. That is particularly the case with respect to Fleet Complete. We have a very smooth and simple way to implement these devices to full ELD. This phase-in period will also align with the approach taken by the US government. The provinces and the territories, just so you know, this is a federal rule. This was a rule mandated by Transport Canada. If you've been reading any releases on social media, the Canadian Trucking Alliance has pushed out correspondence to all the provincial and territorial jurisdictions asking them to adopt the ELD mandate as it is a federal mandate. So stay tuned for that. So these provinces and territories are going to be given time to train safety personnel, develop their own enforcement policies, and consider adoption of their own ELD mandate for intra-provincial motor carriers. So in other words, motor carriers that are moving goods or passengers in commercial motor vehicles where they are staying strictly within a provincial boundary. Since this category of motor carriers is not currently in the Canadian ELD rule. Now, I've been speaking to various enforcement personnel, and I have personally offered to work with them and raise awareness of ELD and how the mandate works, because in terms of lessons learned, I was directly involved in the United States, and I found there were occasional issues at Roadside where the DOT inspector in the United States was not familiar with the differences between an electronic log, an automatic onboard recording device, which is an AOBRD, and an ELD. And there were certainly different types of data transfer requirements. Under AOBRD, you could email a PDF. Under ELD, it was an EROD transfer. So there's a lot of debate at Roadside, and we want to prevent this from happening in Canada. So I've taken upon myself, if the enforcement community is of interest, that I will work with them to raise awareness and understanding how this process works. As you know, there's going to be a number of different devices available in the marketplace. I want to make sure that we have an understanding of how these devices work.
Awesome. Thank you, Marc. We'll go with our third poll question. And as we said at the beginning, we're collecting this information so Marc can speak on behalf of people like you with the committee to make sure that the mandate is as fair and takes all voices into account as possible. Okay, thanks everyone. Marc, take it away.
I'm going to move on now to the grandfathering period. So essentially, there will be no grandfathering period. It's going to be the 2-year window, so June 2021. Approximately 86% of commercial motor vehicles already have either actually the term in Canada, just so you know, is electronic recording device, but for branding purposes, it's being called an ELD just to ensure it's consistent with the US. So Most ELD providers will be able to upgrade these devices to be compliant with the amendment through this free software upgrade using an over-the-air software push directly to ELD. So in this case, this is why Transport Canada decided, unlike the United States, here in Canada, there will be no grandfathering period. Motor carriers will need little time to become compliant while avoiding the cost of any replacement devices. The ELD providers will focus their efforts during the implementation period on those motor carriers that do not have any devices in their commercial motor vehicles.
Okay, we're starting with our fourth poll now. Okay, thanks everyone. As you can see, the majority of you guys said no.
Excellent. So we'll move on now to the motor carrier exceptions, as this is a big feature to be aware of. So ELDs will be required to be used by all federally regulated motor carriers and their drivers of commercial motor vehicles, buses, trucks, who are currently required to maintain a daily log. Now, I want to be clear on this. It is a federal rule, and I anticipate most, if not all, provincial jurisdictions will adopt the ELD rulemaking, but you want to wait for the announcement from either Transport Canada, the Canadian Council of Motor Transport Administrators, or the Canadian Trucking Alliance, and even from myself, just to confirm the dates with which provinces will adopt a intra-provincial, provincial mandate. Now, to better understand what is a commercial motor vehicle, I just want to highlight the fact that this includes a truck, a tractor, a trailer, or any combination of them that has a registered gross weight in excess of 4,500 kilograms, or if it's a bus, it needs to be designed and constructed to have a designated seating capacity of more than 10 persons, including the driver. That being said, you likely all are aware of the 160 kilometer rule in Canada. There's a similar rule in the United States. In Canada, it's 160 kilometers, whereas in the United States, it's the 100 air mile radius rule, if you're not aware of that. In this case with Canada, a driver who either drives or is instructed by their motor carrier to drive a commercial motor vehicle within a radius of 160 kilometers of their home terminal. The driver returns to the home terminal each day. Therefore, if the driver decides to sleep in their sleeper berth, or the driver is finishing their day and ends up in a hotel, they would not be complying with the 160 kilometer rule. The driver must return to the home terminal and must also begin a minimum of 8 consecutive hours of off-duty time. If the driver takes only 6 hours of consecutive off-duty time, again, not compliant with the HOS exception in Canada. The other very, very significant point is that the motor carrier is not off the hook. There still needs to be accurate records. The only exception under the 160 kilometer rule is the surrendering of logs at roadside. So for motor carriers in the audience listening in, your drivers may be exempt from surrendering the logs, but the drivers are not exempt from complying with the rules. What the onus now falls onto the motor carrier, and the motor carrier in this case must maintain accurate and legible records. It must show for each day, 365 days a year, 7 days a week, every day, the cycle the driver followed, the on-duty times. The motor carrier must keep these records and must keep all supporting documents that I'll talk about later on that are relating to these records for a minimum of 6 months after the day on which the record was recorded. I'll give you a straightforward scenario, again, former MTO scenario I would run into quite regularly. I would stop a driver of a commercial motor vehicle. I would get all the credentials from the driver. I'd ask the driver to confirm if he or she was within the 160 kilometer rule. If the driver said yes, then that would end the conversation with respect to hours of service at Roadside. That being said, I also used to be a facility auditor. So I would, in some cases, make a mental note, a written note of the driver, the date, the location, and the unit number of the vehicle. And if I was scheduling a facility audit of that motor carrier, I would use this clause to say, I stopped your driver at Roadside. He was invoking the 160 kilometer exemption. You, Mr. Motor Carrier, I want to see your accurate records now. If you did not have accurate records, as I've described, the driver is no longer exempt, even though within 160 still needs to have a log. And it's equally shared responsibility between the driver and the motor carrier. So I just wanted to stress that for you. There are 4 main commercial motor vehicle exceptions to the mandatory use of electronic logging devices in Canada. Some are similar to the United States and some are quite different. In Canada, if you are operating under an hours of service permit pursuant to the regulations by the Director of Transport Canada under regulation, and I've seen some of these permits, you can all have the opportunity, if you feel that you should be exempt, to make an application to Transport Canada's director to get an exemption. I've seen in cases, as an example, the moving of livestock across Canada, the concern for the safety of the animals. Some drivers, some motor carriers would have exemptions to drive longer hours. So that would fall under the second one, which is operating under a statutory exemption. The third, and this is unique to Canada, it's if a vehicle is subject to a rental agreement for a term of 30 days or less. The next category, and this is identical to the United States, if you have a vehicle that's manufactured before the year 2000. And I want to highlight the fact that the year 2000 speaks to the manufacturing of the engine. You will have scenarios which are included as glider kits. I'm sure you've heard of this term, glider kits. You can have a commercial motor vehicle where the engine is manufactured before the year 2000. There's a date stamp on that, and if you need, I can post on Marc's HOS Expert a link. It's through the Canadian or the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. It shows where the date stamps are found on engines. If you have an engine older than the year 2000 and you have a tractor newer than the year 2000, you are still exempt. So I wanted to clear that point up as well.
Awesome. So now we're going to go with our next poll. So should Transport Canada have adopted all the exceptions in the US ELD mandate? Awesome. So you can see that most of you have said no, and the second most popular is that you don't know.
Okay, so I'm going to move on now to ELD malfunctions and to explain how they are managed. When ELD was proclaimed in the United States, this was one area that required a lot of attention, and there is some misconception by drivers and motor carriers, so I would like to clear those up in Canada. If an ELD malfunctions, and again, it's equipment, and equipment, like anything else, can malfunction. The key here, if you're going to take one important takeaway, is to ensure that all of your drivers in your fleet have at all times in their tractors a blank hours of service paper log. That's the fail-safe, that's the security blanket. That's a driver should have that at all times. If a driver has a malfunction, they may use a daily log to recreate their hours of service. The usage in Canada, a little bit different in the United States, but the usage is capped at a maximum of 14 days. As you know, in the United States, inspectors will ask for the day in question and the previous 7. In Canada, it's different. They will ask for the day in question and the previous 14. Therefore, a driver can use the paper log, maximum of 14 days, or upon return to the home terminal from the currently planned trip. Not a new trip, but if it's currently planned, it's part of the current trip. And this would be confirmed through the documents that are surrendered as part of your business offering if the trip takes longer than 14 days. Once a driver starts a new trip, they cannot continue with the hours of service log in the paper format and need to get this corrected. The ELD itself must be either repaired or replaced and be functionally right on top in order before the commercial motor vehicle and its ELD can be dispatched on another trip. Another key point is the driver must notify the motor carrier when a malfunction occurs. The driver should really use the remarks section of the log to annotate. Annotating in the remarks is what's going to help the driver if stopped at roadside or as a result of a facility audit where certain ELD records are no longer available. It's too late at the time of an audit where a driver has paper logs if there's no annotation. It's really going to protect the driver and the motor carrier if and when an ELD does malfunction. The motor carrier, your responsibilities are you must maintain a register of when the malfunction occurred, what was the nature of the malfunction, what were the actions that you took to either have it repaired or replaced, and I would document that. Documentation, again, as a former auditor, that's where issues would always go sideways with motor carriers. You're best to document than try to explain things away after the fact. This register must be kept for 6 months from the ELD repair date or the date of replacement. And this will be subject to audit by a safety official. It's just another document the auditor is going to ask after the fact. ELD records at roadside or during a facility audit. The driver's record of duty status will be available to the roadside enforcement officer through the display or printout from the ELD. And this is pretty well standard and has been the case for a number of years for motor carriers having drivers under the AOBRD process. You can display the device to the inspector. Some motor carriers have their trucks equipped with printers. They can be printed out if that's what the ELD inspector is going to ask, or the ELD record can be emailed to an address provided by a safety official upon request. This is quite different than in the United States. In the United States, if you're running under ELD, and as you know, the ELD mandate is going to be in full force December 16, 2019, it's important that your drivers understand you need to move and update your systems to full ELD. Until that date, if they're still operating under AOBRD, the display or print or email functions are options to the driver in the United States. In the United States, if you're under ELD, you must send through their EROD transfer of data to the central repository at FMCSA, who will then reroute back to the safety official who has your driver stop. And again, we've seen, I've personally been on the phone with a number of drivers, motor carriers, operating under AOBRD, and the DOT is asking for an EROD transfer. Well, you cannot EROD transfer an AOBRD. Therefore, I wanted to raise that awareness to you on this webinar. So I'll pass this on to Claire for the next poll.
Awesome, thanks Marc. So after that explanation, we're wondering if you think that Transport Canada should have adopted the US EROD transfer of data to a central repository at FMCSA, or is the email to an address provided by a safety official in Canada a simpler process?
So we're going to move on now to the types of supporting documents that are going to be required. Essentially, drivers must forward all supporting documents generated in the course of their duties or received or prepared by the motor carrier. These documents are essentially what I call time markers. And these time markers are used by the enforcement community to ensure that what is being generated on the ELD in fact matches with what is being produced for records. Therefore, as motor carriers, you want to periodically audit your driver's ELD records to make sure that these time markers match. Because if a driver, as an example, has himself or herself booked off duty in the sleeper berth, yet there's a time marker showing that they're doing something active, they're fueling their truck, they're crossing the border, they're getting an electronic signature, something with a date stamp or a time stamp on it, that would not go well if audited by MTO or DOT or a National Safety Code auditor. These records would include all electronic mobile communication records between the driver and yourselves as the motor carrier, all payroll records, settlement sheets, or documents indicating payment to a driver, any government issued document indicating a location of the vehicle, and that in this case would be border crossings or at a way station, etc. Reports, receipts, records, or other documentation that relates to the load. Again, very important, these records cannot be defaced in any way, shape, or form. Otherwise, they will not be accepted or will contribute to some enforcement action taken. Other types of supporting documents would include bills of lading, itineraries, schedules of other documents indicating the origin and destination of the trip, many of which do have these date and time stamps on them. Any reports, receipts, records, or other documents relating to the servicing, repairing, conditioning, fueling, inspection, rental of a vehicle. That rental piece is extremely key, as you do have an exemption under rental requirements. Reports, dispatch, trip records, receipts, or any other document that indicates the date, the time, the location of the vehicle during the trip, including arrival and departure times. Therefore, as you can appreciate, when an officer is asking either at Roadside or an auditor as a result of a facility audit, the first question is going to be, what type of records are you generating, are your drivers generating during the course of business? Once you describe what those records are, they are all part of the review process. I want to now move on to some Canada ELD quick facts. Essentially, the ELD will standardize the processes to prevent errors, logbook tampering, and driver harassment. Using the United States as an example, many were concerned about the launch of ELD, but over time, you talk to some of these drivers and they say, I would never want to be without my ELD now because the process is so much easier. The in and out times at the way stations are so much faster. better log dispatching of times, getting a real appreciation of where the inefficiencies in the industry is taking place. Everybody's playing by the same rules. Therefore, Canada will adopt, or has going to adopt, many of these provisions in the US mandate. This US mandate, as you know, took place in December 2017. There will be some Canadian specific modifications. I do want to stress, though, that these changes to the hours of service regulation, in terms of the maximum hours, the rest times, the sleeper berth times, at this point, there's no discussion on changing the regulation. The only changes will be as to how the drive time is recorded and reported. Now, if you look in the United States, after the rule was proclaimed, there was a lot of pressure from different industry groups, stakeholder groups, special interest groups. The US government, if you're not aware, is in the midst of announcing very soon some changes to the hours of service. It could perhaps happen in the United States, and things such as having these webinars to raise awareness. If you provide me with your feedback, which you think is good, bad, and ugly, and what needs to be improved, I will certainly bring that to the table. But at this point in time, Transport Canada is not proposing any specific changes to the hours of service regulation. Next is the ELD will require replacing paper logs with a regulation compliant device that will connect directly to the engine's ECM. Therefore, electronic logs, which are essentially a paper log in an electronic format, which is easily manually adjusted by a driver, will not be compliant after the June 12, 2021 date. These new device requirements may require existing e-logging devices to be updated or essentially even replaced by the final implementation deadline. So we'll move on now to the next poll that Claire is going to ask.
Awesome. So this poll has two questions. And the first one is that we're wondering what you think Transport Canada should amend the federal hours of service regulation as part of the Canadian ELD mandate. And if you do think so, we're wondering which rule in particular you think that they should change. And at the bottom, there is an all of the above if you feel like that is the best option. Awesome. Thanks everyone for participating. I will share the results now. So as you can see that most of you think yes, they should amend the federal hours of service, and also that most of you thought that all of the rules mentioned above should be amended.
Great, really appreciate the feedback, folks. We'll move on now to some of the similarities between the Canadian and US ELD mandates. At the highest level, drivers of commercial motor vehicles in either jurisdiction will find it easier to stay compliant regardless of which side of the border they are traveling into. The first is with respect to data collection. The data collected by ELDs is essentially the same under both mandates. An ELD records a number of parameters, including at the highest level, the driving time, the engine hours, the miles driven, the locations. And again, if you look at the link I'll share with you at the end, you'll get all of the details from there. The information display for roadside inspections, the documents generated by ELD is a standard format, and it will be displayed under both the US and the Canada mandates. Under both ELD mandates, the driver will continue to have control over their hours of service entries. What I mean by that, in the old world, the fleet managers, the safety directors in the back office could edit drivers' logs without their knowledge or consent. In this new world, the fleet managers can request edits, but at the end of the day, the driver maintains control and will either accept or reject edits. terms of supporting documents, they're divided into 5 separate categories. I touched upon them earlier on in the presentation, so you can see them on the screen for yourself. They're bills of lading, dispatch records, expense receipts, communication records, payroll records are the main areas. Some of the differences are, in the United States, as I said, the data transfer is through the EROD system of the day in question and the previous 7. In Canada, the driver will have a non-editable PDF of the day in question and the previous 14 as opposed to 7. The location sources are also different. ELD vendors will need to get a location for various events such as personal conveyance, yard moves, duty statuses, or any other unassigned vehicle moves. The United States uses the GNIS system for all locations, whereas in Canada, CCMTA will make available a geolocation database that all ELD vendors will use to get directions and GPS coordinates. Big difference here is in the personal conveyance rules. United States essentially has updated their personal conveyance rules. They've been softened. I've got the link I've just shared there. From my perspective, there's no limits on personal conveyance, provided they meet the requirements of what I've included on the link. That means a driver could have a vehicle that's partially loaded. They could be exceeding drive time, but what the key is in the United States is that the driver will manually put himself or herself off duty in personal conveyance. In Canada, the rules are much more prescribed. It's a 75-kilometer limit. The vehicle also has to be unloaded and unhitched, so that means bobtailing with no trailer. The driver has to indicate the odometer reading at the beginning and end date of personal use. Therefore, drivers from the United States coming into Canada will have to comply with the Canadian rules, which are one of the rarities of the Canadian regulation is, in this case, stricter. Otherwise, the Canadian rules from the most general statement is much more flexible, with the exception, in my opinion, of this personal conveyance due to the softening of the US rules.
Awesome. So now we have our second last poll. So we're wondering if you think that Transport Canada should adopt the updated personal conveyance rules that were implemented in the US. Awesome, everyone. Thanks for participating. As you can see, the majority of you guys think that, yes, Transport Canada should adopt the updated personal conveyance rules.
I'll take that back to Transport Canada in future meetings that I meet with them as part of the ELD working group. I'm going to move on now to the registration and self-certification. At the highest level, the United States provides for a self-certification and registration process, whereas in Canada, as I indicated, it'll be a third-party ELD registration and certification process. It should be completed by the end of 2020. The process to actually accredit these certifying bodies will take roughly a year.
Awesome. Thanks, Marc. So we have our very last poll question now, and this one is about those third-party certification and registration processes that Marc is currently discussing. So we'd love to get your feedback on what you think of it, so Marc can let them know what a portion of the community thinks of this type of certification process. Five more seconds. Awesome. So most of you are totally in agreement with Canada that that's how it should be. So that's super cool. Thanks, guys.
Moving on to roadside documents. In the United States, a driver requires the current 24-hour period and the previous 7 days, whereas in Canada, it's the previous 14 days. So very important that you understand these variances. Timelines for the mandate. The public comment period ended in 2017. There was a milestone published target date, Canada Gazette 2, June 3rd, 2019, with the 2-year grandfathering or compliance implementation of June 12, 2021. As I mentioned, I'll stress it again, there's no grandfathering clause here. I've alluded to some of the links. They're now included on this section. It includes the current hours of service regulation, Canada Gazettes Part 1 and Part 2, and the in-depth document being the technical standards for ELD. Next, in conclusion, just want you to raise at the highest level that the Canada ELD rule is not imposed at this point, provincially or territorially. There has been, as I said, announcements requesting that these jurisdictions adopt the federal rule. So right now, the rule will be for federally mandated carriers. And as we evolve, and stay tuned for announcements, as provinces adopt, then it will include provincial carriers. Each province and territory have the authority to decide whether they will adopt some or all of the standards to their regulations. For those of you who have been in the industry as long as I have, you likely know that different provinces, different states, federal governments don't always have the same thought process, and rules become a little bit different. So we're going to just move on now to the Q&A session. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask those online.
Awesome. So I will read out some of the questions you guys have answered. And as I said before, if we don't get to it right now live, we will make sure to answer your question and include it in the documentation that will be shared with you at the end of this webinar. So do not worry, it will be answered. And if in the future you have any questions, make sure to go to our website, fleetcomplete.com, to ask the expert, and you can submit a question there at any point in time that Marc will be able to answer for you.
So I got a question from Shaw Shiraz of Airline Express. This person has asked me 2 questions, so thank you very much for that. I have some transfer drivers who just go back and forth between the airport and our yard. We are located nearby the airport, so the distance travel for these transfers is 1 kilometer to 10 kilometers one way. Are there any exceptions for drivers who drive short haul distances such as these? So the answer to that is yes, and I spoke to the 160 air mile radius rule, and that basically says that the driver is exempt from surrendering the log at roadside. It doesn't preclude the motor carrier from maintaining accurate and legible records. Again, it has to show the day in question, the driver's duty status, the elected cycle, the hour at which each duty status begins and ends, the total number of hours spent in each status, and these records have to be kept for a period of 6 months. Second question, supplementary. Similar to the above, I have drivers who drive 3-ton straight trucks and sprint cargo vans. Both of these vehicles types just require a Class G. So you really want to look at what is the registered or gross weight of the vehicle. If the vehicle is deemed to be a commercial motor vehicle under the hours of service regulation, they will, unless otherwise exempt, be required to surrender a daily log and have accurate records as well.
Awesome, thanks Marc. So the next question that we have here is, all the malfunction issues, what if it's the device and not the ELD itself? Do you still have to keep a log?
Great question. As I had mentioned earlier, the fail-safe, the golden rule is to always make sure that a driver has paper logs in their possession at all times. I've alluded to the maximum times. It's 14 days in total, or upon return to the home location from the currently planned trip. If it's a new trip, then they have to comply with the rules, and by that the ELD must be repaired or replaced and fully functional before the vehicle can be dispatched. The driver has to notify the carrier. The device has to automatically be updated. Otherwise, there will be issues if redeployed back in the field. Folks, we're getting a whole bunch of questions here, so I know we're starting to run low on time. I probably won't be able to get to all of these here. One question I have is, I have a very specific industry question. Can you please share your email? Well, you can go to the Fleet Complete homepage. It's www.fleetcomplete.com. You can click and ask the expert. You can type your question. All these questions come back to me. I will respond back, and it'll also be posted on our website thereafter. So, who is the third party that will be certifying the ELDs in Canada? That has not been publicly announced as of yet. Again, I sit on the federal body for that. And as soon as there's something announceable, they have to go through a whole process and be certified under ISO as well. And that hasn't been completed. I've got another question. Will there be any agricultural type specific rules similar to the United States? I haven't heard back on any agricultural, or even for that matter, any oil field type exemptions at this time. You may want to send some of your feedback either through me or to Transport Canada directly to see about if there's going to be any exemptions. At this point in time, it's whatever's written down in the federal rule. If the driver, commercial motor vehicle has multiple drivers, what do? Each driver would have to have their own unique username and password. As you switch drivers, the first driver will sign within the solution and the second would sign out, and you would accept the appropriate drive time. If you forget to do so, what will happen is you'll end up with unassigned driving time, and that would then have to be reassigned back to the driver.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marc. We didn't get through all of the questions, and as I said, they will be answered. We'd like to thank all of you for attending this webinar. We hope that it was helpful, and as Marc said, we're super open to your feedback, and we wish you a really great rest of your day.
Thank you very much, all. Have a wonderful day and be safe.